I hope everyone has had their first cup of coffee so we can kick off the second day of the Riga conference. Yesterday when we started, we talked about the importance of Riga as the place from which to analyze world affairs and to try to come up with solutions. And I think in the first day, we captured a few of those main ideas. There were calls to action. There was a sense of Europe falling under the European umbrella for its own security if Europe is able to step up. Let's have more of these ideas today, because the solutions that come from this room with a level of ambition that can be harnessed from the Riga perspective are going to be essential to be applied in Brussels, at a NAC table, transatlantically, and globally. And yesterday we heard so much about the global dimension of the very small and local challenges that are felt everywhere. So with that, I'm going to kick off the first discussion of the morning. This is a session on, is neutrality geopolitically obsolete? Neutrality. Does it matter today? And with that, I'm going to turn to the moderator, Ian Bond, the Deputy Director of the Center for European Reform. Please kick off the morning for us.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Christina. And thank you very much to all of you for turning out at such an early hour on such a beautiful morning in Riga. It's always a pleasure to be here, but it's an especial pleasure to be here when autumn is looking so good. So I admit that neutrality is not a topic that I had thought a great deal about before 2022. I had rather taken it for granted that there were a certain number of neutral or non-aligned states in Europe, that some of them had chosen permanent neutrality of their own volition, like Switzerland. Some had had it thrust upon them, like Austria. And some had chosen to be neutral for situational reasons, but could change their minds if they saw fit, such as Finland. And I suppose that I thought, they had all basically made those choices because for geographical or political reasons, they thought that that was the best way to protect their own security. And perhaps as somebody who had worked in the UK delegation for NATO, I occasionally wondered whether they were free-riding on the defense that NATO provided for Europe, or whether alternatively for some of them, they actually had to spend more on defense than if they had been part of NATO. So, that was before 2022. I suppose the other question, and we may explore this in the discussion that I had, was about the morality of neutrality. It was always a bit of a puzzle to me that a social democratic country like Sweden, with a strong attachment to human rights and the rule of law, had nonetheless gone through the Second World War supplying raw materials to Nazi Germany. Why had that happened? But I think the whole question of whether you can be neutral or non-aligned in modern Europe has really come into sharper focus after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And we have seen the changes that it's brought about. We've gone from having 6 neutral or non-aligned states in the EU to having 4, because Finland and Sweden, with remarkably little fuss, have shifted from being non-aligned states to being members of the alliance. So that just leaves Austria, Cyprus, Ireland and Malta as the remaining neutral and non-aligned countries in the Union. But I don't know what that means in modern Europe, and I don't know how sustainable that status is. So I'm hoping that our terrific panel this morning are going to be able to help us to think through some of these questions. And if I just move along the line in introductions, so to my immediate left we have Julian Lindley-French, the chairman of the Alphen Group, director of Europa Analytica in the Netherlands, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in London, which I think should come in handy for this discussion, and a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Then Viola Gienger from Just Security, the Washington senior editor of Just Security, which is an online forum for the analysis of security, democracy, foreign policy, and rights. a research scholar at New York University School of Law with a focus on foreign affairs, US foreign and defense policy, international security and development, and a former inhabitant of Belarus. Perhaps not directly relevant to this, but an interesting background to have. And finally, on my extreme left, but as somebody said yesterday, not politically, Rihards Kols, the former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Latvian Saeima, and now a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament. So I'm going to start by asking Julian, what about the practical side of neutrality? When is neutrality a good survival strategy for a country, and when is it not? So, why has Switzerland not been invaded for a couple of hundred years? Why did neutrality not protect Belgium in 1914?
Thank you, Ian, and good morning, everyone. I must admit, when I saw that I was on this panel, I thought it was a bit like asking Genghis Khan to discuss flower arrangement. And I also have to say that I don't think you have to equate neutrality with disengagement. I think that's important. Reading the rubric of this panel, my first option was, are we secretly talking about a future option for Ukraine? Could it be neutral? No. Are we even talking about a future option for the EU? Could it be neutral? No. Power is power. And Ukraine has the same problem that Belgium had historically, which is geography. Location, location, location. Belgium happened to be in the way of the German Imperial Army on its Schlieffen Plan through to France in 1914, and the Wehrmacht's route towards the self-same France in 1940. So unless the guarantors of Belgian neutrality, which in this case was Britain and France, were really willing to invest the power to preserve Belgian neutrality against the Wehrmacht, and effectively so, it was always a fragile affair. When I was working at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy many years ago, so therefore I count myself as the Swiss representative, I was chairing a meeting of NATO principals in Brussels, and they asked me about Swiss neutrality, and I said, well, basically you have to understand that Switzerland is a corrugated superpower. If you flatten Switzerland out, it will be bigger than China and twice as rich, and therefore shouldn't be messed with. But the reality is that Switzerland is conveniently placed to serve the needs of many powers. And on top of that, Switzerland's geography would make it very hard to invade anyway. It's an incredibly difficult place to overcome, given the nature of it. But that does not mean to say that Switzerland is disengaged. Quite the reverse. My very presence in Geneva was a mark of Swiss engagement as part of the Partnership for Peace programme. The very hosting of UN bodies in Geneva. The nature of Swiss diplomacy is that Switzerland simply plays a different form of engagement than traditional power. Why? Because there's no real benefit from Switzerland playing any other role. It could never generate the kind of military power that another Western major powers could generate, and therefore it chooses for domestic reasons to play this particular role. Ireland's a curious one in the sense of every day now the Irish ask the British to send the Royal Air Force over Irish airspace to intercept Russian bears trying to enter Irish airspace. The Royal Navy right now as we speak is currently engaged in Irish waters dealing with some Russian intruders. So Ireland, in a sense, is neutral, I would say, by luxury, by simply sitting next to Britain. The Irish, for probably his understandable reasons, complain about us eternally. Fair dues, may have a reason for that. But at the same time benefit from us as well. But then if you go to places like Lebanon, in fact, one of my movement protection team in Afghanistan was Irish. you'll find the Irish are engaged again. It's not that they're not part of any alignment, they are aligned. They're not formally part of any grouping. But then you have India, which is a very different form of neutrality, non-alignment, which is simply chosen to be non-aligned and powerful enough to make it credible, to force other powers to deal with it as a player, without aligning itself in the formal way that many of us have. So I don't see neutrality as being obsolete. I think the nature of neutrality changes with geopolitics. The Irish, the Swiss, the Austrians and others quietly behind the scenes are often playing a very constructive role in seeking peace. But for obvious reasons of scale and capability, that's a more effective investment of their talent than trying to generate military power or mass diplomatic power that we have in countries like US, UK, France and Germany and others. So that would be my initial take in.
Great. Okay, that's excellent, and I think is a nice segue, because you've raised there the question of, you can be neutral without being disengaged. So my question to Viola is about morality and a different kind of engagement, the morality of neutrality. Elie Wiesel, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1986, very famously said, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. On the other side, the Swiss Federal Council was asked to look again at the question of neutrality in 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they concluded that the practice of neutrality still provides Switzerland with sufficient leeway to respond to events in Europe following the outbreak of the Ukraine war. So, was Wiesel right? Are there circumstances in which neutrality is the right moral answer?
I think what's interesting about that is I sort of look at this issue in the broader sort of peace and security frame, and I'm not sure that you can make such a blanket statement as to say that it's always to the benefit of the belligerent and not to the victim, because just as Julian was expressing, if you look at Switzerland and the role that Switzerland has played in the larger peace and security realm, they very much had a role in advancing peace, in hosting institutions that are intended to try to prevent conflict, and institutions designed to deal with conflict and mitigate conflict when it occurs. So I look at it in this larger framework. When you're talking about neutrality, what kind of neutrality and how is it in fact implemented? And that gets to sort of the vagaries of foreign policy at all, right? And it shifts over time. It has to adapt, of course, but I look at this, for example, from my experience in Eastern Europe. I lived in Belarus for 2 years, from 1997 to 99, supporting independent media. I'm a journalist by profession. And then I lived in Poland for 9 months and worked in the broader region in Russia, in Slovakia, in Ukraine, and then in post-war Bosnia. Also doing support to independent media in a variety of ways. And what I saw there was this sort of, ever-shifting foreign policy on the part of the United States. Some of the work that I was doing was under a U.S. Agency for International Development contract with an organization that was implementing media assistance in the region. And for example, the ratio of U.S. funding just for independent media and support to independent media was sort of the ratio was sort of ratio to population was sort of opposite in Belarus and Bosnia. In Belarus, we had about $3 million over 3 years for a population of 12 million. In Bosnia, we had $12 million over 3 years for a population of about 3 million. Why? Because Bosnia was sexy. You know, it was the war that everyone in the West had been seized with for 4 years, and now, you know, the attention was trying to help Bosnia rebuild and so on and so forth. And I mean, so the rationale was very much dependent on the U.S. domestic political context. And the same is true for countries who are adopting a position of neutrality. It shifts over time based on domestic constituencies, based on the geopolitical context, of course. And moral questions have a lot to do with that. I think evaluating the effectiveness of a position of neutrality has to involve, to a certain extent, what that country is doing, not just militarily, not just politically, but also in a lot of other spheres, in diplomacy, in development, in the related field of peace building and conflict resolution. You know, if a country is going to take a position of neutrality, what does that mean for their relationship with their neighbors, with the larger world? And I think that's a complex puzzle, and again, it has to adapt over time, but is also subject to the whims of, not only the whims of an electorate, but the whims of the political leaders themselves, because an electorate will follow, for better or worse, a political position, right, if it is articulated strongly enough. So I remember, so we spin forward a bit to Afghanistan. I remember when President Barack Obama came into office in the United States, and the U.S. electorate had definitely tired of Afghanistan, so to speak, at that point, but there was still a chance, some people thought, of trying to make a difference. And the administration then very quickly formed a study group to try to decide how a way forward. And ultimately, the president decided on a plan to try to, in fact, surge the military back into Afghanistan and accompany that with a diplomatic surge, but also put a time limit on the military surge. The time limit, I think, was proved to be a mistake, and people thought it was from the beginning. But that speaks to that complex internal political dynamic, right? That just illustrates how these things shift over time. At the same time, if you look at that situation, the diplomatic surge really never materialized to the extent that the military surge materialized, however constrained that was. So that is, you know, one of those big issues that always has to be taken into account. What else is involved in that dynamic other than the military?
Okay, thank you very much. So the EU, not a military power, a different set of considerations maybe. But Rihards, I mean, the EU has a mutual defence clause in effect. Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union says, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. But then there's a get-out clause. This shall not prejudice the specific character of the security and defense policy of certain member states. And I wonder, when I look at that, do those 4 states think that in circumstances when, I don't know, you were attacked, they would be able to say, well, we're sorry, we can't help Latvia because if we help Latvia, we have to help the country that's attacking it? Or is there an evolution in the way that the remaining European neutral and non-aligned countries are thinking about neutrality? So, as the EU debates having a bigger role in defense, is that compatible with the traditional notions of neutrality and non-alignment that some member states have?
Well, yeah. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Bond. I really want to always express in public, Mr. Bond, either if I'm a friend or a foe or a villain. But I guess I hope I'm a friend.
Just as long as you don't expect me to die, okay?
Well, I would just start with that thank God that the sole guarantor for security, as far as I am aware, is still NATO within Europe, and it should remain in that way. So the Article 5, and it's totally different structure on the responsibilities for the member states in particular. When it comes to the EU clause 42.7, already 42.7 means how far in the back this priority is, whereas NATO Article 5, and a certain step that leads to Article 5. So that is already just very briefly. When it comes to the neutrality within the EU in general, I have to go back in history as well, because history does matter. And well, I have to say that it is obsolete. Because, well, you mentioned Belgium, 1914. Kaiser already said that the Treaty of London is just a scrap of paper. Then it's Netherlands, 1940 as well. And with this, why I'm saying it's obsolete, because I will actually go back to State Secretary Dulles, who actually said that its neutrality is exceedingly becoming obsolete. And that is 1956. And that's where we see that since 1956, the involvement of international law, it really has gone skyrocketing in a way for the international community, what we are calling the rules-based international order. So therefore, in 21st century, somebody said that we are neutral, it's actually hypocrisy in a way. One or another way, they have an obligation when it comes to international law. UN Charter, for example, it's a fine example. They have to protect it and have to call the aggressor accountable. So therefore, this is already saying that somebody says, I'm neutral. No, you have international obligations. So that is a lie in itself. If you look from the history, if the neutrality by definition, which is, it's mainly for the smaller states to maintain their independence and sovereignty through not participation and maintaining impartiality in events. But again, at what cost? And we see the 20th century that has shown that if you sell the soul of neutrality, neutrality becomes hypocrisy. And here I'll state, maybe somebody can like it or not, the examples. Sweden selling iron ore to Nazi Germany, that was a precondition for their maintaining neutrality. Switzerland, taking care of Nazi gold. So where's their neutrality? So at some point, if we come back to 21st century, and we come when explicitly we talk on the Russian aggression, I think it's not only the neutrality is obsolete, but it's liability in a way. So coming back to what you said on the Article 42.7, yes, there are 4 member states that you can apply maybe this escape clause, as somebody says. There is a mutual kind of responsibility, but then there's an escape clause. I think the brutality and also the nature of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, it's not just isolated conflict, it's way beyond that. And I think that is something where EU member states registered that. The fine example of that is Sweden and Finland joining NATO. This comes back to what I started with, that thank God NATO is the sole guarantor of defense and security in Europe. And it also signals that Article 42.7 is slightly hollow. So that is the decision for Sweden and Finland to join the NATO. But of course, also when it comes to previously mentioned countries, Ireland and Austria itself, their leaders have articulated that they're not 100% neutral. And increasingly so because you cannot be neutral when there is a hybrid attacks, hybrid warfare fought. You don't see your enemy, so you can be neutral in a way. You're affected by different means. Disinformation, cyber domain. That is also articulated by the Article 42.7 as can constituent to common security and defense. So with this, well, the Article 42.7 has been activated once so far, 2015, terrorist attack in France. So we see the effects of it as well, how it's used in practice. So I don't want to dwell, I'd rather go to the Q&A session because I generally believe the neutrality is obsolete, but one very important thing when it comes to neutrality that is, well, again, when it's obsolete, is actually what I've determined, protect your candidates. And this is very crucial. This goes back to the 90s. We saw the war in Balkans. After the war, EU reached out and granted the candidate status to numerous countries in the Balkans. But for the first time, the candidate country status is given a country that is at hot war. And by this, you cannot say I'm neutral, because it will be, the hypocrisy by definition. Because you're saying, okay, we grant you candidate status while you fight for your survival, but for time being, since you become the member, we're neutral towards your, sovereignty and territorial integrity. So by this design, Ireland, Cyprus, Malta, they're no neutral countries. They have actually obligation, because candidate status, it's not something in a limbo. It's actually, I see it already as a membership by other means. So if we're generous about our credibility, EU, then stating that we are neutral when it comes to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, we should carefully choose our words.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. Julian, you wanted a two-finger on that, and then I will open the floor.
If I may, and thank you, great introduction from my colleagues, but look, let me be blunt, because I really get tired of conferences, everyone turning up and saying, NATO should do this and we should do that, and we're not doing it. I would suggest that we are neutral in the war between Russia and Ukraine. We have chosen to be neutral. Now, we give Ukraine weapons, not enough for them to win, but we're not prepared to actually really take sides on the Ukrainian side that would ensure Ukraine would win and therefore guarantee Latvia's security. I've just published, I'm sorry, and I have to do this, this book called The Retreat from Strategy, which is brilliant and very reasonably priced. And it's really about how Britain doesn't really pull its weight in NATO, although we talk a lot about it, and therefore put countries like Latvia at greater risk because of it. And yet we all talk about how wonderful NATO is. I think not just neutral countries, and I'm a great fan of Le Chevalier Talleyrand. I think all diplomacy is ultimately hypocritical. But even the so-called non-neutral states are increasingly becoming selfish, lacking solidarity, talking the language of engagement and alignment, but when it comes to some very, very big policy issues, to all intents and purposes, adopting a policy of armed neutrality. So I do think that there's a danger that in neutrality, far from shrinking, might be spreading.
Interesting. Okay, let us kick off the discussion from the floor. And I've got a question here from Artis Publics and then one from Paul, right?
Yes, I think, yes, one's coming.
Actually, good morning. Actually, I think this discussion in this panel today is much more important than we might think, because this is showing a connection line between a number of things, which is neutrality, morals, and values. And I would say that values, it's something which motivates us, people or countries. Morality, which constrains us. And now, if we are looking what is happening through the prism of the Ukrainian war, then actually I would say that the concept, for instance, of European Union, which have been always declaring that this is union of values. When we were joining in European Union, like Latvia in 2004, we are joining common values. I think Russian invasion and war against Ukraine and Russian war against West today is actually devaluating our value system because we are not acting according to our values and we are not acting morally according to expectations to us. And I totally agree with Rihards, what he told, that, you mentioned 4 countries which are kind of neutral. How can you be neutral if you signed for the same values in European Union? That is not anymore neutrality. And then the question comes further from these value expectations from yourself and morality expectations from others. When does neutrality turn into crime? Because it's not just about country, how much to help, or for instance, country X, like I will not name this case, is not giving a permission for another country to give weapons to Ukraine because they have some screws over there, in that weapon system. So is that value-based society? Is it a moral international politics, or is it a crime, actually? If you walk on the street and somebody is beating somebody else up and you tell, well, I'm kind of neutral here. I have a high value level myself, and I'm a very moral person, but it's not my business. I apologize. Just continue beating him up. So when does it turn into crime?
Well said.
Okay. Rihards, do you want to reply?
Yes. Well, yes, we want to see a rapid action from the member states, from the politicians. I will not go in such a bitter assessment, because what happened with Sweden and Finland, if we look at the history, the time frame, it's overnight. And that's a huge tectonic shift. And this word is being used, all these tectonic shifts and so on. Even with the Switzerland, yes, we have to maintain at least the countries that are, the front lines. And we understand the real dangers of it. We just have to need to keep pushing on that. Keep pushing on that, not keep silent and addressing that at the highest potential level. And then, for them who are still saying we are for the peace, this is the new trend. It's not about we're neutral, we are for the peace. Right. Well, all the rest are warmongers. No, actually, we are defending our values here. And I think even with Switzerland, yes, that has been very diplomatic, but I think there should be a list of the countries who are still supplying the components for the Russian missile rockets and so on, publicly available. And then, for people who are saying, well, we're neutral, but still we're okay that their schools are being bombarded and etc. So this should be the political pressure on even to the nations, not only to the country, to the nations as well. And Switzerland, at some point, they have already broken their 200-year long-lasting neutrality, applying sanctions partially, but applying. So that is a change.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting points there. I think that links actually to something that Viola said, and you may want to go on further on this question of the total effort made by a country like Switzerland, you can't just look at one element of it, but you have to look at the total. So, is it a bit misleading to say, well, this is like, walking past two people who are beating each other up on the street? I mean, if you are a representative of Switzerland or another neutral country, do you say, well, actually, we are doing the following list of things to contribute to making the situation better?
Isn't it, please, why don't you both come into my house and let's have a chat about this?
Well, maybe, I don't know. Viola.
Well, and when you look at this particular situation right now, and in so many of these issues, in fact, I mean, this is, with no dispute, the war in Ukraine, the Russian 2022 all-out invasion, and in fact, going back to 2014, is a crime of aggression under international law. So what is neutrality in that?
Yeah.
Neutrality is, are you going to be neutral on a question of international law? And then where do you go from there? So I do think that it is important to have certain individuals, leaders, countries that can play a mediating role, a moderating role, but whether neutrality is an effective, valid moral, much less moral position in this kind of war. And I think even those countries who are officially neutral, as you've mentioned here, are not necessarily neutral on this conflict. But in practice, I think whether we're willing to put our not just money where our mouths are, because we're putting plenty of money in there, but is that the issue?
Risk.
Yes. Risk. Yes, and that's where you get into those inconvenient truths again. Taking a further step, taking those further steps that we're alluding to is a risk, and it is uncomfortable. And maybe we've all, in the West, sort of become so spoiled by our prosperity that it's hard to engage on issues where you may have to put more into it than money, weapons.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right, I'll take two questions together. So I'll take one from Paul Brummel and then one from the lady next to it.
Okay.
Okay. Well, those two to begin with, if I may. I don't know where the microphone is.
The owner of
right here, Ian.
Oh, you've got it already. Excellent.
So I'm Paul Brummel, UK ambassador to Latvia. I spent 3 years as a British ambassador to Turkmenistan, which is a country which actually has its permanent neutrality endorsed by the United Nations. It has one of its major festivals devoted to its own neutrality. But thinking about the different fates of the constituent parts, by many cases by occupation of the USSR since 1991. If you look at the European members, all of them pretty much have made a clear choice. I mean, some instantly and enthusiastically, like the 3 Baltic states moving to the west. Others, like Ukraine and Moldova, having a more complex course, but essentially heading in the same direction. Others, like Belarus, taking the different course. But in Central Asia, it's been very different. I think all 5, to varying degrees, having adopted some form of neutrality or more nuanced view. And I just wonder, I'd be interested in the panel's views on the reason for that difference, whether it's because in Europe it's a sort of binary choice between NATO or Russia, whether in Central Asia it's because it's a much more disparate set of choices, having to sort of maintain independence against a lot of jockeying powers for position. But why is there a difference there in approach? And I find myself in an interesting kind of neutral corner of this gathering next to the Swiss and Irish ambassadors. So I think it's to the Irish ambassador I now turn.
Excellent. Right.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, and yeah, my name's Emer Friel, Irish ambassador here in Latvia, and I guess yes, nice to be in a triumvirate of ambassadors here, and interesting that on the panel I don't think there is a voice from a neutral country, so otherwise I might have stayed neutrally quiet, but would like perhaps to just mention that there was a couple of points that came out very strongly in the presentations, which I think are really important to emphasize in order to get an appreciation of where countries such as Ireland, which maintains the policies that we do, stands. I perhaps might take some debate over some of the characterizations of Irish neutrality, but indeed the important point is that it's military non-aligned, but not politically neutral. And that's really important to recall. It's really important to recall the various different elements within our toolbox that we do employ to be an active and globally engaged member in the pursuit of what the Irish people have particularly expressed as within the value system, which do align, I would argue, with the European values along the lines of human rights, standing up for international rule of law, for humanitarian law, our development aid program, very extensive. You mentioned UNIFIL, our engagement in peacekeeping operations. But it's felt very deeply within the Irish public. There's constant conversation happening, very live conversation and very live examination of what it means to us is our global actor role in the world. So my question, I suppose, to the panel is, within your spheres of activity, how much does that domestic understanding from within the neutral countries come across? And do you feel that it's understood, or we could be, perhaps engaging further in how we get that understanding across? I think, Viola, you alluded to it, but I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay.
Will I continue the triumvirate just to get the full?
Why not? Yes, especially given the time. I think let's pack some in, and then we'll move on to some of the other questions, because we've got quite a few other hands going up. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Martin Michelet. I'm ambassador of Switzerland to Latvia, and yes, I disagree with my friend Rihards on the issue of neutrality. Switzerland is at the UN Security Council at the moment, and there is no week that passes without Switzerland taking very clear position in relation to Ukraine and international law, and telling to Russia what is our position. We, for that reason, and also for applying the EU sanction, we landed on the list of unfriendly countries drafted by Moscow. We are in good company there. And I think, yeah, the question is also what you do with your neutrality. And in the case of Switzerland, it's not a goal in itself, it's a tool. And the debate about obsolete of neutrality, of course, Switzerland has been neutral long enough to hear already in 19th century and in early 20th and so on and so forth, neutrality is obsolete. What I observe is that Switzerland adopted all the EU sanction. Not all members, non-neutral members of the Western group did, including NATO member did not. So what does it mean? And what you do, Switzerland is organizing conferences. In June we had the Ukraine Peace Summit. We organized it with Ukraine. Over 100 organizations and countries were in Switzerland. And I think would be hard to do it if Switzerland had taken another position. And maybe that's my question. I would say, especially when talking to a country in the south, where this debate has been quite a lot about Europe, and I understand this, but I found very interesting the idea of maybe it's spreading, because I think in the world, many countries support international law but do not want to take sides, and maybe neutral countries like Switzerland can play a role to rally these countries for the greater good and for international law. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not entirely sure there was a question at the end of there, but okay. Do you want to comment on those three quite quickly? Because I see we have 13 minutes, and I have about
I agree with their
5
excellencies.
hands. Oh right. Well, that's very easy. Okay, Rihards.
On Central Asia, I guess the difference is to be part of alliance, something broader. There's a collective defense. And I think there's not much choice over there. You have Russia, you have then ever-increasing ambition on China as well. Of course, it shouldn't be played as an excuse, as we see right now, even with circumventing sanctions. The biggest issue is with the Central Asian countries. I will not name which exactly. And well, I don't know if we are in a position to blame them or not. Of course, we have to encourage them that in the long-term view, that's in their interest actually to align. Yes, we saw the Central Asia actually played a crucial role during the fight against international terrorism as well, being the partners as that. But I think again, it comes back to neutrality, the big challenge, where we are part of the collective defense alliance. We go and we declare the values we defend, and as a community go. But when you are all alone, and you are obliged by international law, and this is, I'm not trying to find any excuses. I condemn even Mongolia's decision not to arrest Putin. Which really undermined the legitimacy altogether, the jurisdiction of ICC. And again, that is, I guess, a very clear symbol that they want to be neutral, at least to signal that we're neutral in a way. Is it right or wrong? So they're jeopardizing their legal obligations and actually causing the heat on themselves, because I've been calling at the EU level actually to impose sanctions on Mongolia on that. Really, because we have to abide by the laws that we actually are signing up. On Ireland, yes, no, I mean, of course, it's evident. It's not an easy discussion within the domestic politics. I know that for sure. But I know your former Prime Minister said that there's alignment in so many different ways. But still, it puzzles me, and it's. I don't know, maybe afterwards we can talk, but during the Second World War, Ireland sent condolences to Hitler's death passing, right? Now,
but actually were very helpful to the British.
Yeah, but then Ireland sends right now condolences to the Iran's butcher as well, whereas the whole EU doesn't do that. So I don't know if that's signaling we want to be friends with everyone. But then again, are we going to live to the point where, let's hope that comes sooner than later, on Putin's departure, and we got going to express condolences to the Russian people? So this is sometimes it's really confusing, I guess, maybe not for the politicians, but for the general public. So where do we stand, and what cost we stand? So I'm stopping here.
Yeah. So I think the answer is that the domestic background is perhaps not well understood. Viola, did you want to?
Yeah. I think what we're getting back to here is this question of diplomacy. And are we, we talk a lot about military neutrality or political neutrality, and we talk immensely, and now I'm about to somewhat contradict what I was saying before about being reluctant to make the tough decisions to do more on Ukraine, for example, than just weapons. But on the other hand, are we doing enough before it gets to this stage? It seems to me that in so many matters of international affairs these days and conflict, we are not moving fast enough, firmly enough on the diplomatic side and on, and richly enough on the development side to forestall, to prevent getting into the situation in the first place. And, in the United States, defense secretaries, at least going back back to Robert Gates, who I covered as a reporter for Bloomberg News, and Leon Panetta after him, same thing. They marched up to Capitol Hill and in their bilateral meetings with members of Congress, they were constantly pushing for more funding, not for the Pentagon, for diplomacy and development.
Yeah.
And they said, you either give me more diplomats or you give me more weapons. And guess what we're doing? We're providing more weapons, right? So, I remember one of the figures that they would bat around at the time was that the Pentagon had more lawyers than the State Department had diplomats. So, that's where we are.
Yeah, okay. Let's take another round of questions. So I'll take the French ambassador. There was a gentleman at the back, and then I will take the gentleman in uniform here.
Thank you very much. I'm Manuel Laforapnouille. I'm the new French ambassador in Latvia. And panelists shouldn't fight the question, but I'm not a panelist. So on top of neutrality, which is a very important discussion, as you've shown, I'm wondering if we don't have a multi-alignment issue in Europe. Multi-alignment is what countries from the south speak about. But basically, isn't that the case already, for instance, in NATO, that we have some countries who believe that diversification is the name of the game, that it's not just an economic game, it's also a geopolitical game, and who are trying to get the best of several worlds. It's not the traditional neutrality problem that we have, but multi-alignment would be the new neutrality. And then if that's the case, I see people nodding on the stage, then doesn't it say something about our credibility?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so.
Thank you very much. My name is Matti Posio. I'm a newspaper editor from Finland. As a Finn, I just would like to briefly point out that the neutrality for Finland during decades was not a question of opinion or feeling or not even political dispute. It was something dictated by necessity. And from our point of view, probably this panel is a little bit obsolete one because Finland joined NATO on the first moment when the marbles were in the right position. It might have been the last time for us when it was possible, and it might have been the first time for us when it was possible. And what you needed to have is Russia once again being messed up and weak and stuck in Ukraine. And I'm very grateful to all Ukrainian defenders here because they are holding up the Russian forces. So Russia was weak. We needed Sweden to join with us. Sweden was not ready for decades. That's another question the Swedish expert could talk about for long. Of course, the United States needed to back the decision, and the opinion of the Finnish people needed to change. And when it was possible, the opinion changed, and it was not, I don't think it was some megalo change, hectic, something all of a sudden. It was the opinion of the Finnish people that we defend ourselves, we make ourselves safe. And this is how we do it and do it now, the question of timing. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Gentleman here at the front.
Can I?
Defense attaché of Latvia to Ukraine and to Moldova. Russian aggression foreseen attack along the Black Sea in order to join with the Trinestian region. And it was a very dangerous course of action. Now, 20 October, in 2 days, it will be presidential election in Moldova, as well as it will be a referendum concerning the joining European Union. Currently, in the constitution of Moldova, they are neutral. They would like to change it. And my question is, if there is all diplomatic means applied in order to help this country to not be as a part of this war and to sustain and become as European Union member?
Okay, very good question. Yeah, why not? Why do we do that? We'll just take the last two questions and then we'll give it back to the
Thank you. Klaus Wittmann, Potsdam University, former General, I found very pertinent what Mr. Kols said earlier, and I find indeed that the debate about neutrality, which sometimes appears a bit academic, has much to do with a totally distorted concept of peace. And you may be watching the phenomenon in Germany of the alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, the former exponent of the communist platform, who in the 3 state elections in Thuringia, Saxonia and Brandenburg had a sensational success. Her election poster said, "Peace or war, you have the choice now," which I call Volksverdummung, making the people more stupid. And with her demand to stop arms deliveries to Ukraine in order to get out of what is called the military logic, that will lead to a peace, which means handing Ukraine over to Russia. But since the Christian and the Social Democrats, are dependent on her for coalitions to keep the far-right AfD out, you will see in the coalition treaties, or at least in the preambles of these treaties in these 3 Eastern German states, a reflection of this distorted concept of peace.
Okay, yeah, I don't see how Germany and NATO and the EU can be neutral, that would be, well, yes, catastrophic. You've got 1 minute.
Okay, Alan Riley, College of Europe. My point is very, very simple. It's about getting to the point of neutrality. And the point I've got about this is that you can be neutral, but you can't be defenseless. And you have to, and given the geostrategic situation that we are in, the pressures on neutral states in Europe, I mean, okay, we talk about Ireland, and the question I think to start with is to say one can be neutral, but one has at least to be able to defend oneself. I mean, if you go back, De Valera understood this entirely during World War II. The Irish state had like 150,000 troops to draw upon during World War II. Equally, but I don't want to just focus on Ireland, if you take Austria, the issue there is more about the penetration of the state. And then again, it's about, if you're going to be neutral, you at least have to be able to defend yourself, both in terms of institutional structure and military. And surely that is the basis. And my question is surely that's to be neutral, to be effectively neutral, you have to be able to defend yourself. And that's the first basis before we have any other discussion.
Okay. 30 seconds each. I'm looking at the clock ticking.
The ambassador said that this is a game. You use that word several times. It's a bloody dangerous game now. And I like your approach of multifaceted engagement. But it mustn't become another metaphor for appeasement, which is such a danger now. Neutrality is an instrument of power, and it's specific and tailored to the individual state and its own view of the world. So I don't think there's a blanket neutrality concept. But as I said at the beginning, neutrality is not disengagement. All the countries cited so far in Europe as neutral states are heavily engaged in international security.
Okay. Viola.
And I think all of this gets back to that point about diplomacy, and I think we have to clearly deal with the conflicts that are so rife right now, and in the course of doing that, put many more resources into diplomacy, and then when the time comes, development to prevent these sort of situations from arising in the first place. But diplomacy now, and also diplomacy for the brewing conflicts that are going on. And it's got to be creative diplomacy, and creative diplomacy requires bandwidth to think beyond the immediate crisis of the particular moment and think of more creative ways of addressing these, not with appeasement, I totally agree with you on that, but with firm and assertive diplomacy on a number of fronts. And you saw some of that in the beginning, in the first months after the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the diplomacy of the UN. Even that didn't go far enough, and it did not extend far enough in time.
Okay. Rihards, last word to you.
Oh, last word. Well, it's very simple. I would cite Reagan: peace through strength. Diplomacy, sorry, I mean, the collective West, as Putin says, have really already lost it in a way with the Minsk I, Minsk II. There's no credibility to it anymore. It's only through strength that we can actually push. So Moldova, absolutely, it's not only the referendum, it's the decision on starting the accession talks, and that is already getting rid of the neutrality because they're becoming aligned with EU policies, be it the foreign, security, defense policy that is very much paramount. And it's not only Moldova right now, just in 1 week's time, another crucial election in Georgia as well, where actually what the colleague said about the Germany and the peace, choose peace or war, this is exactly what the Georgian Dream are doing in Georgia as well. Putting posters with destroyed Ukraine and then prosperous, Georgia, and choose what do you want for Georgia. So this is a bigger game, and diplomacy is. We want to prevail. Diplomacy will always work in behind the scenes, absolutely, absolutely. I have no doubt that there is contacts both for US and Russia at some capacities and so on. But to have any, for us on demand that we're going to put the conditionality on Ukraine, we're not in those positions anymore.
Diplomacy diplomacy does not mean accepting defeat.
No. I'm going to have to wrap it up there because we have already run very slightly over. In defense of diplomats, as a former diplomat myself, I would say I think there is a role for diplomacy, but I am also with Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Diplomacy is much more effective that way. Really? Anyway, thank you very much to a great panel. Thank you very much to a very engaged audience. Okay.
Thank you, Viola.